Hello everybody, hope you're doing marvellously well. I'm sitting here with Charles from Cali. How are you?
Good. And yourself?
I'm pretty darn good, I thank you ever so much. And Erik from the Echo Bar.
Good to see you.
Good friends, lovely to be here at the Echo Bar studios with you both. So we come here today to talk about room acoustics. This is an important subject that I get asked about, I don't know, maybe 10 times a day, whether it be under videos or even directly from emails. And every room I've been in affects the way I hear my speakers. And of course, I have speakers I've been using for, I don't know, maybe 25 years now. So I know how they sound. However, I can go to a different studio, bring my speakers, and they sound different in that room. Now, not all of us have the time to adjust to those listening environments. And the reality is like every environment affects how we hear our speakers. So, even so much that sometimes beginners are encouraged to only use headphones, and they of course have their own set of problems. But for me, a speaker in a room is the best real-world way of working. So, let's talk about the method that you use, and you have already used in this room, to tune the speakers.
So I'm using a moving microphone method for tuning the loudspeakers in the room.
A moving microphone method. So you're moving this microphone all around the room, picking up obviously, and creating an average of all of those results?
Correct. So what I'm doing is, and I'm actually focusing on the area where the person that's going to be listening, where you're going to be doing your work, and moving the microphone through that area.
What can you tell us about this? Is there something unique to this?
Well, what's really cool to me is that the measurements are accurate.
Yep.
They're repeatable. And they're fast.
We like the fast idea.
When you're making measurements with a microphone, if you're using, as an example, a single point, you're not getting the spatial average of a volume of space. Now, I need to say that using a single point microphone is the right thing to do for setup such as time alignment, such as checking polarity, such as checking your room setup. But for the purpose of doing EQ adjustments, you want to get a spatial average, right? Now you can do that with taking 216 microphone measurements in a volume of space, but it really takes quite a bit of time. A moving microphone allows you to get the same answer much faster.
Marvelous. So from my perspective, I have speakers I love and I often travel with them, although quite frankly, sometimes these speakers I use are in most studios. And as I was talking about earlier, each room sounds so different and affects the way I hear those speakers that it takes a little bit of getting used to. And hopefully I'm doing a record long enough in a room that I do get used to it. But it's not ideal. So what are the benefits that you have found using this system?
Well, I think it gives you some reassurance about what you're hearing, because not only can you see it, it's repeatable like we talked about, but especially for rooms, like you said, if you're going to have to travel around a lot and you're in different rooms, it just feels like it takes the guesswork out of it. This room here, it's my room. I designed it. I built it from the ground up, so I'm very familiar with it. I work out of here regularly, so it's great. But no room is perfect, number one, and the frequency response in the room changes drastically where your listening position is and where you set your speakers up. So I feel like this process is something that's very good for helping you fine tune it to where you really know what it is that you're hearing.
Fantastic. So what do we have here, Charles?
This is a MiniDSP, DSP in a box, and this is what we're going to be using to implement the room tuning we're doing today.
Okay, can you explain to me, as naive as I am, what is it doing?
Okay, so what we're going to be doing is your input signal comes into one side, your output signal comes out the other, and inside there's a DSP, and it implements equalization filters that we're going to determine using REW.
So is this your device?
This is not our device. This is made by a different company, but it's a device that's inexpensive and works really well.
So how much is this little device?
It's $140, I think.
Marvelous. And Erik, you know a little bit more about this. Tell us about this.
Well, I just got mine hooked up in here as we tuned the room the other day, but it's fantastic because it works really well with Room EQ Wizard, REW, and you can determine the filters through REW, and this box connects directly to the computer USB, and it'll offload that, and you just sync it, and boom, done.
So what we're essentially telling everybody is instead of spending several $1,000s on speakers that have this technology already built in, for a fraction of that cost, you can introduce that technology to whatever speakers you're using in your room.
Yes.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, why don't you guys, who know what you're doing, I don't, show me how you do this.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to show you how to set up REW to make measurements. And we're going to come into REW. What we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to make sure that the export file to the DSP is going to be in the right format. So we're going to go into File.
So this file format is the file format that the MiniDSP app needs to read.
That's correct.
Okay.
So what you need to do is you can File, Export, Set text delimiter, make sure it's a comma. You can spend a lot of time going round and round. If you don't have a comma in there, it won't read it. So make sure it's a comma. Then we're going to set the preferences, and it's a little bit different from Mac and Windows, but it's still under preferences.
And this is all based on the type of equipment you have, the interface that you're using, the measurement microphone that you're using. These are the parameters we're going to set up. So they might be a little different depending on what everybody else is using.
That's correct. And it's also, I think the interface is a little bit different between Windows and Mac, but you know, it's the basics are still the same. On this one, it's looking for sample rate, and that's of course right, 48 kilohertz. We're using a Scarlett 2i2 as the output device and the input device. In the PC, I believe it asks you for an ASIO interface for this. PC interface, I think left is output 1, right is output 2, but this one, left goes to left, and timing reference right goes to right, and that's good. Then, of course, we need, once we have the sound card set up, we're going to set up the microphone, and this is the microphone calibration. And you know, if you get a good measurement microphone, each microphone is going to come with its own calibration file. Some other microphones that aren't necessarily made for measurements will have a kind of a generic calibration file. And of course, if you can't afford something, we'll, in a separate video, show you how to calibrate give a basic calibration for a microphone for the purpose of room tuning.
Cool. And so just to clarify, the calibration file for the microphone it's actually the frequency response of that individual microphone, and the reason why we have to put it in here is so that that frequency response of the mic itself is subtracted from our measurements. We don't want it to skew our measurements in any way. Is that right?
Correct. We want to measure what the room is doing, not what the microphone is doing.
Great.
So what we're going to do is we're going to browse for that. I already have a calibration file for this microphone, and I am going to load it here. And now we are ready to go.
Great.
Okay, so basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the microphone and we're going to move it around in the area where we're going to take our spatial average. We're going to move the microphone gradually and slowly, and we're going to kind of keep our body away from the microphone to avoid having a profound effect on the response that we notice in this area. Now, you know, you might think, do I hold the microphone like this? Do I hold it like this? Do I hold it like this? And it's an omnidirectional microphone, so you're going to notice a bit of a difference in the frequency response above 5 kilohertz or so, but we're really only concerned about frequencies below about 700 hertz for the purpose of room tuning. So it really doesn't matter. Just again, you know, move it slowly, move it consistently, and practice it a couple of times. When you're going to notice when you have this right is when you can make 3 measurements, and those measurements are the same every time you measure. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start the pink noise. And while moving the microphone, we're going to go ahead and start the measurement. Start the pink noise, and of course you notice that after the first 40 seconds or so the curve stopped moving, and that's because as the number of averages increases, you converge on what the spatial average is.
Can I try it?
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to hold the other end of this cable so you don't create any other noise. And I'll do the measurement here for you. Okay.
So I'm going to start before you hit the pink noise. We want to be moving when you hit the pink noise.
Yeah, what we're going to do is you're going to use nice big circles and you're going to measure in that space. Okay. Hey, Warren, would you like to try?
You should try it.
Sure.
All right. So, Warren, are you ready?
Ready.
All right, and here we go. Okay, so there are 3 of us, and we all took 3 different measurements. And those measurements are, we're going to move our hands a little differently. The way we hold the microphone is going to be a little differently, but you can see that these 3 curves are right on top of each other. Okay, and so it's repeatable. And this is important because, look, if you take 3 different measurements and you get 3 different results, I don't know about you, but I'm not going to have a whole lot of confidence in what I'm measuring.
And I think it's important when you look at this graph, sure, you can see some very slight deviations like here, but I think it's important to recognize the scale that we're on. These 60 to 65, this is a 5 dB increments here. And so this kind of thing right here is so very close, but the overall shape of this curve follows.
Yeah. What I would recommend, and you mentioned this, is to take a couple measurements. The measurements are fast enough. You can take a couple measurements and average those measurements together.
So is there, inside of this software, is there a way to now make an average of those 3?
Right there. Average the responses. Bam.
Click.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we've got this average of the 3 together. What do you think this is telling us about the room?
This is just the loudspeaker in the room. What we're noticing here is that in general it's pretty good, but the low frequencies, the bass is a little bit lower than the mid-range frequency, so we'll have to deal with that. There's a couple of areas here where there's a little bit of lumpiness. In general, it's fairly smooth to begin with, so this is actually going to be pretty easy.
Okay. So obviously we're talking about 4-inch monitors with no sub. And is this a characteristic that you're used to seeing in rooms where there is a bit of a dip here? See, we're about 120 probably, we're starting to see like a 5 dB drop, and even about 60, especially 70 hertz here, we've come down to like a 10 dB. Is this a typical thing that you're seeing?
I wouldn't say it's typical or atypical. Each room has its own personality, as it were. Some rooms are going to put a big bump on the bottom end, which is wonderful. Some rooms are going to pull it back a little bit. Now, when the room is pulling out energy in the low frequencies, you can add that back in, but keep in mind that when you're adding it back in, you're taking away from the headroom with the loudspeakers. It's not a fault of the loudspeaker. It's not necessarily a fault of the room. It's just that how those 2 things are interacting together. So you can EQ that and make it right, but also one of the things you might want to consider is using a subwoofer and positioning that in the room to couple to the room differently than your monitors sometimes where you're faced with this, rather than using EQ and pulling away from the headroom of the loudspeakers.
I would say the overriding experience I get from people sending me mixes to critique is inconsistency in low end. Now that can be anything from it coming back massive and boomy to frankly having no low end whatsoever. And I've had the privilege of talking to people on Skype calls, and they'll go around and they'll show me their studio setups. And this is very typical, because this isn't a console, but Erik's definitely laid it out so it feels like a console. Obviously, ergonomically, you can reach over and you can adjust things. And these kind of reflective surfaces, either recording consoles or setups like this, are pretty standard for most people. And they, of course, create all these different, issues that we associate. And it's always the low end that seems to be the inconsistent area. And it takes, people are hearing the 40 and 60 hertz on the kick, and then they send me a mix, and it's just not reproducing because they've got excessive amounts of it. But more often than not, it's this kind of thing that I see, or I hear more importantly. I hear a low end that's just blowing up all over the place because they're not in rooms that reproduce the low end accurately enough, so they're overcompensating for it. To you, we were talking about the dynamic range of a speaker. So that you don't want to take a 6-inch driver and just say, oh, okay, I need to put 5 to 10 dB at 60 or 70 hertz to compensate. That's a foolish way of doing it. So that's where subwoofers become.
That's correct. So yeah, it's not unusual to see this this type of response, whether it's the room or whether it's the surfaces that are in front of the loudspeaker. And you could look at this curve as an example, and you could decide to put in 6 or 7 dB of EQ to fill in that in the shelf and the bass. But then you're taking away from the headroom of the loudspeaker. What you might want to consider using a subwoofer, positioning it in the room so that it fills in that area and it's not working so hard.
Great.
All right, so what I'm going to do now that I have my 3 measurements and my average of those 3 measurements, I'm going to go and open up the EQ window, and I'm going to review the settings. I want to make sure that the equalizer is set to MiniDSP, because that's what I'm using. My target settings, I'm going to level match at looks like about 80.5 dBSPL, and that gives me my target settings. Then I'm going to look at my filter tasks. I'm going to close that window. Look at my filter tasks. I want to equalize from 40 hertz up until about 600 hertz. And one of the things that you'll notice that if a whole portion of the curve is underneath the target, it just won't get there with automatic EQ. So in order to facilitate that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a manual filter here, and I'm going to put in a peaking filter at, let's say, 65 hertz and a gain of 6 and a Q of about 1. And it's going to fill that up. It kind of extends beyond that, but we'll let the auto EQ do what it wants to do. So now I'm going to match response to target, and it's going to do that. Now I notice here that around 95 hertz, it's kind of left a opening, and sometimes it's not exactly perfect. We're using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the bands. That should probably be okay. And of course, that's the band. Those are the bands of EQ that we have available in MiniDSP. So I'm going to save these filter coefficients to file, and in this one, I'm going to call it right monitor. And I'm going to have it in my folder, and I'm going to save that. Okay, so we're going to set up the MiniDSP, and we're going to open up that. And now we've already made all of our connections to our loudspeakers, and we already have an idea of exactly how we're going to set this up just by the way we hooked it to loudspeakers. What I'm going to do once you open this up and everything's connected, we're going to press that green button to connect to the system. And if you already have a setup file, you can hit synchronize, but we're starting with a new setup, so we're going to restore to default, and that's going to basically make sure that the DSP is refreshed and all the settings that may be in it are
wiped out.
Wiped out, yeah, exactly. Okay. So it's going to do this, and now connection to the board has been established, and we can talk about some of this. So what we did when we set up these speakers, we have input 1 and 2 from the source, and then inputs 1 and 2 going out to the speakers.
So our source, for me, I'm using Pro Tools, and it's coming out of my interfaces, and I'm using Lynx Aurora interfaces. So I'm taking the main line outs that normally I would have connected to my speakers, but I'm putting this MiniDSP in between that. I'm putting them in between my interface and in between the speakers.
Right.
Okay.
And we're using left channel is number 1, right channel is number 2.
Yep.
Okay. So input gain is here. If you want to make any settings to this, we're going to leave these at 0. Input 1 is here. Input 2 is here. So you can apply parametric to each individual input. We're not going to do any of that right now. Routing, we're going to set input 1 to output 1. Input 2 to output 2. Now, if you were going to do a subwoofer, you might do something like this, where you then send input 1 also to output 3 and input 2 also to output 4. But right now, we only care about inputs and outputs 1 and 2. We're going to need to go in here, and we're going to need to make sure that the crossovers are all bypassed, because we're not going to do any crossovers today. And we are going to verify that they're all zeroed out. Okay, now we have our parametrics, and these are where we're going to be loading the output from REW in.
So these parametric EQs are on the output here versus the parametric EQs that are directly after the input gain. Why do we have 2 of those? Why do we have the parametrics on the front, and why do we have the parametrics on the back?
Okay, so the parametric on the back is, and I can see why, I use the parametrics on the back side to do speaker level correction. So in other words, when we're doing the room correction in REW, I'm going to put that EQ right here. Now, if we're going to put, as an example, a shelving filter, because sometimes you're going to want to apply some extra low frequencies, or roll up the hyzer, or do some salt and pepper filtering, you're going to want to put that up here so it applies to everything the same.
Okay, so the parametric EQs on the back, those are going to be loaded in from Room EQ Wizard.
Right.
And then ideally you like to use these parametric EQs up front for maybe some taste type things. Sometimes people like to boost their subs a little bit, or maybe make things a little brighter. You'd want to do that here manually on your own.
Right. And then the other cool thing about it is that when you're doing these filters here, and you can put in, let's say you want to put a low shelf filter in there, you can set your filter the way you want it, and then you just copy it to input 2.
So copy the settings right over.
It works a lot faster, works easier.
Great.
Some of the other things that you can do when you're doing this, let's say if you have a subwoofer and you want to time align the subwoofer to the mains, you can go into the output for the subwoofers, and you can set delay either for the subwoofer or for the mains, depending on the latencies of each one of those, to get those time aligned. You can also do gain adjustments and or polarity flips in these output filters. But today what we're going to be doing for room tuning is we're going to be just loading this room tuning into parametric EQs.
Great.
Now I've got that saved. Now it's the time that I'm going to bring up the DSP, MiniDSP interface, and I'm going to go into the right speaker here, and I'm going to import the REW file. I'm going to point it at that file that I just created, and I'm going to open that. And it's going to import that those DSP parameters. I'm going to make sure that they're all occupied. and that should be good. The next step we're going to do is we are going to verify that the DSP has, in fact, is made of effect. So just one thing, we're going to bring up the generator again and the RTA again, and we are ready to do another measurement. Okay, so we've just made a confirmation measurement to confirm that our EQ has been implemented and it's working correctly. And for that, REW has a cool little overlays. Notice that when we go into, we go back into the average that we had here, and we look at the EQ, we had what's called a predicted SPL. Okay, now what we can do now, and close that one out, is we can go into overlays, and what we've done is we've highlighted the predicted SPL. And so what it's doing is we're taking the predicted SPL with EQ, which is this curve here, and we're comparing it with what we just measured, because we haven't applied any EQ on that. And as we can see here, again, two different measurements, slightly, random movements, but these two curves agree with each other, and that gives us confidence that the EQ that we wanted to be in there is actually in there. Okay, so I want to summarize a little bit. So we started with 3 measurements here that agree with each other.
Yep.
But then we made an average of those 3 measurements. So I'm going to get rid of these 3, just keep it clear.
So we're just looking at on the screen now this one curve, but this is the average of those first 3 measurements that we took.
That's correct.
Okay.
And so now what we've done is we went into the EQ, and if I show both curves, it shows the average of those measurements.
Right.
And then we did the auto EQ to get those together, and the predicted SPL is right here.
So this is what REW is predicting. This is what we want for our speakers to look like.
That's correct.
Okay.
Then we exported the coefficients to a file. We imported them into the MiniDSP
app. Yep.
Correct.
Okay.
And then we measured the system after the DSP was put in place.
So with the new EQ, with the MiniDSP, we took a new measurement, and we're looking at that.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the overlay function, and this is showing the average.
That's the prediction that REW made.
Right, and that's because its predicted SPL is highlighted. It's the prediction that REW made, and versus the measurement that we just made to confirm. And as you can see, those 2 measurements are right on top of each other, so we actually got the results that we intended.
Excellent. So we just finished the right speaker. We need to do the left speaker now.
Yep, just the same way. Okay. And so we're going to go through the speakers, we're going to EQ those, and most importantly, then we're going to listen to the system. We're going to compare what we're hearing to what we're measuring and make sure it makes sense.
Great.
So thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Rather wonderful. Thanks for letting us use your space.
Of course, thank you.
And being a willing participant as well. Actually allowed me to sit on the couch and check some emails while you were doing that. So always good. So we have a companion article which will go with this, but actually more importantly goes with Mr. Glenn Fricker's video, which will probably be out around about the same time. Links to that as well. And that shows the whole setup of a room.
Right.
And that be rather wonderful. Also, another video that we are going to host is doing this, how can I say it in the right way? The most inexpensive way. This is inexpensive as it is. That the software is free, isn't it?
Yes.
So the software is totally free. That's wonderful.
Runs on Windows and a Mac.
And a Mac.
And we do encourage the viewers to participate and support the software.
Absolutely. And we will have full links and everything to this gentleman's rather lovely software. So this inexpensive version is going to be really the most inexpensive. You're going to use correct me if I'm wrong, a $6 microphone?
A $6 USB microphone calibrated by our loudspeakers close enough to be able to place loudspeakers in the room and to be able to make some decisions as far as EQ.
That's pretty awesome. So $6 microphone. And we just talked about off camera. Also bypassing that lovely little box and using a generic stock. Why don't we go stock on the DAW, stock EQ on the master bus, where you can emulate the results that you're getting with the REW software. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So don't forget to check those 3 things out. We're going to have links to Glenn's video. We're going to have a link to the blog and of course a link to this other video. Excellent. So as ever, please leave a bunch of comments and questions below. If they get really smart, I might ask you to answer them.
All right, we'll be glad to.
Okay, you got that on camera? He said he'd be glad to. All right, thanks ever so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.